please text otherwise in the inbox. I, Ria Jain, is here and very pleased to welcome you on today's webinar by Mrs. Ishita Sharma. Good evening, ma'am. Mrs.
Good
Ishita
evening, Ria.
Sharma, Mrs. Ishita Sharma is an advocate by profession and a career coach by passion. After graduating from National Law University, Visakhapatnam, she has been working as a finance and insolvency lawyer and has been extensively practicing commercial litigation across all India, but predominantly in Delhi. She is an experienced legal professional with expertise in handling matters related to insolvency and bankruptcy code 2016, custom, indirect taxation, and real estate. Alongside, she has been imparting career guidance to law aspirants and fresh graduates, which with time has enhanced her capabilities to understand the psychology of her audience. Collaborating her rich legal experience with vocal skills, she has been able to impart various career talks and lectures on array of legal and social issues. She has authored Ultimate Success Guide to CLAT and LLB entrants and is an established author at Central Law Publications, Allahabad. She was the founder director at Gurukulam Learnings Private Limited and chairman at CLATtutorials.com. Both the endeavors dealt uh, both the both both the endeavors dealt with guiding and counseling law aspirants from inception to the end of their law journey. To know more about Law Shastra, everyone is requested, all the participants are requested to please turn off their screens as well as their mics. Thank you. To know more about Law Shastra, please visit our website at www.lawshastra.com. Ma'am, we all are very pleased to have you here and are eagerly waiting for you to begin.
Thank you, Ria, for the wonderful introduction. Am I audible to everyone? Is my voice clear? Sumita Dhar, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I think everybody can hear me. So, today I'm going to discuss about the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. As the title suggests itself, I will talk about its evolution, its market practices, and the ground reality. Since most of my audience present here are law students, I would be taking it up in detail from the scratch and clearing it out on the basics so that you don't incur any problem in future. I will discuss major issues and key issues as to what is the difference between the insolvency and bankruptcy, which in the beginning most of us fail to understand. And thereafter, I would move on to the evolution, the history, the need of the insolvency laws, and how did it develop in India per se. Moving further, I will discuss some key terminologies in this subject. And later on, I will talk about the sections of the Act and its implication with respect to COVID-19. To start with, as you can see on my screen, I hope my screen is visible to everyone. I will explain the meaning of insolvency. Now, what do you understand by insolvency as a layman? As a layman, the term insolvency means when someone has gone out of money, has run out of money, and is unable to pay its debt. So, insolvency is the state of being able to pay the money owed by a person or the company on the time. Those in the state of insolvency are said to be insolvent. It is a statement of financial distress. Here, insolvency means that you have a debt on you, but you are unable to pay it. Okay? You owe some money to somebody, but you are unable to pay it. You can be a corporate person or you can be an individual. So here, your state of being unable to pay the money is the state of insolvency, where the person or the company is in the state of financial distress. Moving forward, we will understand the meaning of bankruptcy and the difference between the two. Bankruptcy is a legal process through which people or other entities cannot repay their debts. Okay? Just a second. I'm getting too many notifications, yes. So bankruptcy is a legal process through which people or other entities who cannot repay debts to creditors may seek relief from some or all their debts. Okay, in most jurisdictions, bankruptcy is imposed by a court order, often initiated by the debtor. So under bankruptcy, when a person declares himself as a bankrupt, again, the person or a company here is financially stressed, they are unable to pay their debts, by virtue of which, to release the burden of debt upon themselves, they approach the forum. Here it says it is court imposed. Okay, so they approach the court for an order to declare themselves as bankrupt, as in they won't be able to pay the debts, and whatever assets they have shall be liquidated, and the business will be liquidated, and whatever minimum debts can be paid off will be paid. So this is the difference between insolvency and bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is when you approach a jurisdiction, when you approach a court body to get yourself released of the burden of debt. Whereas under insolvency, you are just stating that you are in this condition of financial distress. Okay, this is the major difference between the two. Now, why do we need insolvency laws in India, or for a matter of fact, in any other country whatsoever? Insolvency laws emerged due to market practices. Any nation, any country, any organization functions on the basis of market forces. Of course, when there is market, there is business. And when there is business, there are glitches, there are debts, there are creditors. So when all of them combine together in a system, a force plays between them. Okay, now this force has some glitches. Sometimes people pay the money and don't receive back. Sometimes people receive the money, which is less or not equal to as to what was promised to them. So how to get rid of this tussle? Every time approaching them directly or approaching them through a third mode is not the solution. So definitely, to make sure the market runs in a proper manner and there are no hurdles, that the liquidity in the market is always maintained, the need of insolvency laws here comes into picture. So to address the issues of debtors and creditors, the insolvency laws came up in India. Now let's see the main aim of any insolvency law. This aim, which I'm dealing with here, does not relate to the IBC per se, it relates to the general insolvency laws. Okay. So the main aim of insolvency law is to replace free for all legal regime with a proper process for orderly collection of the debtor's asset and fair distribution thereof. Earlier, insolvency law was concerned with individual insolvency, where there was no collective procedures leading to the creditors acting individually, and the law had a punitive approach. Only later did the concept of rehabilitation develop. So here it says that how did insolvency function in earlier times? In earlier times, for most of the insolvency or bankruptcy matters, the law had a punitive approach. That means the penal approach was implemented. That means if I owe maybe lakh or 1,000 lakhs to somebody, I will be punished for this. But the other person might not get the money. But does this solve the purpose? Punishment for not being able to pay the money, does this solve the purpose of the corporate debtor or the creditor? No. So moving forward, only later did the concept of rehabilitation develop. So under Indian law, a company is considered to be a person, a corporate entity who is a person in itself. And a person, and when we say that the company is treated as a person, we do not say it just for the sake of it. The law means it. And when I say the law means it, it is the intention of the law to dissolve or kill the company as the last resort. So if you hate somebody, for example, or you don't like somebody, or somebody's sick, okay, somebody's not performing very well in your house, in your family, in your school, college, anywhere, or somebody's sick, what will you do? Will you go and kill them straight away? Or will you try to heal them, make them fit and fine, make them run back on their legs, or remove them with their impurities and try to make them a better person? These are the usual ways by which we deal with humans in general. So in the same way, the law perceives that a company is also a person and killing the company or dissolving the company in legal terms should be the last resort. So therefore, only killing the company should not be the intention of any law. Okay, this company is in a lot of debt, let's kill it, let's dilute it. No, this should not be the intention of any company. So later on, the concept of rehabilitation developed. Now, what does rehabilitation means in the terms of company? Means to revive the company, bring back its business, try to cope up its business, maximize its assets, and make it stand on its legs again. Moving forward, it says there was bifurcation of approaches towards the systems which were all prone to manipulation and malpractices. Various committees were set up for credit security and debt, but none proved proof. The numerous loopholes led to the setting up of the court committee to review and provide recommendations. It was then that the well-defined legislations of insolvency law developed, whereby all abusive practices were taken into account. Now here, abusive practices always creep in within the loopholes of any law. Now, these abusive practices crept into our system as well, which I will be dealing down when I move further in this document. Remedies were laid down, and even the interest of secured and unsecured creditors were given life. Insolvency law system has certain objectives that it tries to achieve, namely, to restore the debtor company to profitable trading, to maximize the return of the creditors as a whole, to establish a fair and equitable system for the ranking of claims and distribution of assets, identifying the causes of the company's failure and imposing sanctions for culpable mismanagement by its directors and officers. So this paragraph particularly deals with the current insolvency law, the changes, the developments which it has brought through, and the mistakes which has been happening in the past have been corrected, and this is the new system with which we are playing in under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. So the insolvency law policies and regulations play an important role in the economy and in the society. Of course, because it governs the major market practices, is make sure that the market and the market forces are free of debt and the least NPAs exist, because as less NPAs in the country, the better the GDP, the more successful the country, the nation in its whole will be. They allow honest but unfortunate debtors to obtain a fresh start by relieving them from their debt. Insolvency law policies also allow resources to be quickly returned to productive use by enabling viable but financially troubled companies to restructure instead of filing out bankruptcy. Okay. So this was the need of the insolvency law in our society. And here, the stress under the IBC was laid down on the restructuring of the whole business. To move on to further, I would like to give you a brief idea about why the IBC law came into picture and what was its intention. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, as perceived by many practicing lawyers as well, is in the sense that it is a recovery forum. Now, by recovery forum, I mean that used as a forum to recover any debt which is pending on the opposite party. So, the financial health of a company as to how it has been performing in the last quarters or the previous financial years, how many debt has it got? Has the debt increased the number of assets of the company? Are the number of creditors decreasing with every passing year? Are there no profits booked in the books of profits? Now, these are some parameters under the balance sheet of a company, by which you can figure out whether the company is up and running and a healthy company, or it is a sinking ship and needs help. So the idea is that before a company actually becomes bankrupt, the law should be able to identify it and hold it there and try to either revamp it and bring it back into the mainstream business and make it healthy, or to dilute it and finish its existence so that it does not become a burden on its creditors. Now, suppose early insolvency of a company is not detected and it is allowed to run till it goes bankrupt. What all problem can it create? Number one, all its creditors, being financial or operational, will suffer losses because most of the businesses are run on credit, be it financial or operational credit. Now, what is operational credit? I will explain. Just give me 2 minutes. So, when a company is in a dilapidated state, the key managerial persons of the company, they are able to sense it that this company will not be able to survive for more time. Maybe in some cases it's 6 months, it's 1 year or 2 years. So the managers, the directors, or the KMPs of the company are able to establish by their books the health of their company. And once they know it, they try to extract as much from the company as it is possible. While they extract the resources of the companies for their personal use, they are committing an offense under Section 50 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So the IBC bars any company to extract any assets or the funds of the company for their personal use. Before the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, there was no such system. When the directors or the KMPs used to realize that the company is no more going to survive, they used to sell the computers, the lands belonging to the company, used to waive off their employees, let them go, and they used to do things which would now come in under the bracket of malicious practice. And they would use all of that money for their benefit. How? They would sell the assets, and the proceeds of such assets were either, transferred to their relatives' account or to another company which is owned by their son or daughters or maybe other distant relatives. All of this is termed as a related party transaction, which is barred under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Earlier, there was no such practices. So to stop all this, to stop all these illegal activities, and to make sure that the interest of the company prevails above the interest of its KMPs or the directors, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code came into picture. Before this, there was no strict straitjacket formula to prevent the health of the companies. But now, after this law, the scenario has changed. Let's see forward. The history or evolution of insolvency laws in India. From where did it start and how did we reach to IBC? So there has been a reservoir of laws on insolvency prior to the IBC that came and went, and which apparently failed to resolve the complex bankruptcy issues. The non-performing asset crisis surmounted, however, no one-stop solution emerged. From Sikh Industrial Companies Act 1985 to Provincial Insolvency Act 1920, the Presidency Towns Insolvency Act 1909, the Code of Civil Procedure 1908, and the Sarfacy Act 2002. The journey has been quick and full of potholes that effusively started, however, later failed to stick to the very purpose of which they were established. Now, this chart here shows the evolution of the laws. Just a second. As stated above, it started with the Provincial Insolvency Act, Presidency Towns Act, and the rest followed. Now we are going to study a comparative analysis of all these laws with the IBC and figure out the differences between them and now. So I hope everyone is ready. So this is really important. Get your pens and papers and jot it down if you can. So there are certain basic criteria to invoke an insolvency. Okay. So the first is the trigger amount. That is, at what amount will you say that a company should be brought under the ambit of the insolvency law? So under the SICA, that is Sikh Industries Act, which we mentioned above, there were two criteria. Okay. Number one was that the company should have existed for at least 5 years, which means If a company of a lesser age than 5 years has defaulted for any amount, it cannot be brought under the ambit of insolvency. And second, it says that the accumulated losses should be greater than or equal to the net worth of any financial years, which is again too much, that you're waiting for the losses to be so much so that it becomes equal to the net worth of any preceding financial years. If you allow a company who is, only 5 years old, as in this case under SICA law, and you allow the debts to be surmounted to the extent that is equal to their net profits of previous year, how can one expect a company to repay its debt? So here there is no solution except that the company has to die. Secondly, let's move to RDD BFI Act. So this act maintained a threshold of rupees 10 lakh or more than rupees 10 lakh. Under SARFAESI, any amount of default was marked as a trigger point, and this default should be owed to the secured creditor only. Here there was a glitch under the SARFAESI that it dealt with secured creditors only. Further moving forward, under the restructuring mechanism, which came by an amendment in the RBI Act, it stated that the aggregate exposure not exceeding 10 crore rupees. The threshold under this mechanism was 10 crore rupees. Now, under Insolvency Act, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the minimum default amount is rupees 1 lakh to file an application. Now, let's talk about IBC. Why the default amount of 1 lakh, which is the least out of all, was taken? Because the previous mechanisms showed that 10 lakh or 10 crores or any amount subjected to only secured creditors or amount which is greater than or equal to net worth did not be fruitful enough, and that most of the people could not approach the forum directly because the amount was either too big or not sufficient enough for them to be able to proceed to the forum. Now, 1 lakh was decided because it was decided by the law enforcing bodies that this amount in today's financial terms holds a decent value in the life of a business person starting from a grassroots level to the top. Okay, so keeping that in mind, the amount of rupees 1 lakh was kept. Further down, let's see the objective of all these acts. Under SICA, the objective was rehabilitation and revival of sick industrial units. It did not cover all the forms of companies and was only limited to certain form of companies. But under RDD BFI, the objective was establishment of specialized tribunals such as DRT and DRAT, that is the Debt Recovery Tribunal, and the Debt Recovery Appellate Tribunal to recover the money due to banks and financial institutions. Now, RDD BFI dealt with only recovery for banks and financial institutions and not to all other creditors who were suffering. That too through DRT, which was a very time-consuming process. Moving further, under SARFAESI, the idea of the law was enforcement of security interest over the property of the borrower and establishment of asset reconstruction companies. Now, since most of you are still in law school and are students of second and third year, I would like to explain here the meaning of enforcement of security interest. So I've cited it as one. Now let's see what it has got to say. So when a financial institution enforce their interest and improve recovery by exercising power to take possession and sell the securities secured by the borrowers against the loans. So let us, before understanding enforcement of security interest, let us understand the difference between a secured creditor and an unsecured creditor. So a secured creditor is a person or a bank which gives loans by taking certain assets against that loan. Okay. Whereas an unsecured creditor is a person or an entity who gives the loan without taking any assets against that loan. Now, under the first category, that is the secured creditors, the loan is given in proportion to the worth of the property or the asset given in exchange of the loan. The loan amount given under secured creditors bracket will not exceed the value of the property given in lieu of that loan. But under the unsecured loan condition or the unsecured creditor gives loan only on the basis of goodwill or reputation or future interest of the company if he believes in that. So who is secured in between both of them? Of course, the secured creditor is more secured because if the debtor fails to repay the money, the secured creditor has an option to enforce a security interest on that particular asset or land or whatever was given in lieu of that loan amount. But whereas, on the other hand, the unsecured creditor has nothing in exchange to impose his right upon to recover his money. So therefore, this I hope this makes it clear what is the meaning of enforcement of security interest. It means when a debtor is unable to repay his loan, the creditor has a right to enforce its security interest over that particular property and try to get back his loan. So this practice was not existing before. But under the SARFAESI, this law came into picture and it developed into this direction, which was very well incorporated under IBC as well. So let's start again. It says the objective under SARFAESI was enforcement of security interest over the property of the borrower and establishment of an asset reconstruction companies. Now, the financial institution or the secured creditor will enforce its security interest upon the property of the borrower, but how will it execute it? Because the function of the secured creditor is not to go around and get the debts released. This is not its job. Its job is to give money or take money. That is what it mostly does. Keep a bank or a non-banking financial institution in mind when I'm talking about enforcement of security interest. Okay. So how do they move forward? They create a special purpose vehicle, okay, or an also known as an asset reconstruction companies. So a person who defaults in paying loans is declared as an NPA, that is a non-performing asset. So those non-performing assets are further be forwarded to the SPVs. Now it is the job of the SPVs, that is the special purpose vehicles, to recover the money from them. How? How will they recover? Because here the bank has already created a security interest over the assets. Now the SPVs will take over the assets, conduct auction, sale, negotiation with the debtors, and by that way, the debt is released. But somehow SARFAESI also did not exist for long, and the mechanism, though sounding very technical and very fruitful, did not work very well. Moving forward, let's see what the RBI suggested. The objective of the RBI was to change in the terms of existing, terms and conditions of the debt, as in to create a threshold or to create a link of mechanisms to provide limited instead of exorbitant debts to the debtors. Whereas the objective of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was maximization of the value of assets. This objective was recognized after 4 failures in the past. So what happens when the IBC code maximizes the value of the assets? Now, when a company when a debtor has committed default, an application is filed under the code, and the trial begins. Under this procedure, the IRP comes into picture. He takes the command of all the assets of the person who has defaulted and tries to maximize the value of the assets. As in, the first of all, the valuation of the company is conducted from scratch till the end. All the transactions are tracked. They made sure that no fraudulent transactions have happened in the past. All these fraudulent related party transactions, which I explained in the past by the directors, are taken into account, booked, and a separate application is filed under section 50, 52, 53, 54. There are sections following that. It is called the avoidance application. Okay. So under this application, the RP approaches the court and brings into the light of the court that these are the fraudulent transactions which have happened, and that it is the duty of the court to give directions to the debtor to bring the money back to the company. Why? So that the value of the assets of the company can be maximized, and with this maximized value, the debts of the company are released, and that the shareholders get the maximum profits out of it. So this was the whole idea behind maximization of the value of the asset under IBC. Moving down, the adjudicating authority. The adjudicating authority under SICA is, let's see, it is BIFR. It's called the Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction, and IFR, that is Appellate Authority for Industrial and Financial Reconstruction. Moving down, it is DRT and DRAT, as I explained above for RDDBI. For SARFAESI, the process was carried out with the intervention of the Chief Metropolitan Magistrate and the Chief District Magistrate. So here, any party who was aggrieved by the action of the bank or the financial institution may have filed an appeal to the DRT and DRAT. And that was how they functioned. So this was an extremely time-taking process. The average time was 2 to 5 years, and it was not very fruitful. Under the RBI Amendment Act, the RBI regulations and enters a voluntary agreement between two creditors. So the agreement was never abided to, and it was always a case of, contempt, a breach of agreement leading to contempt. So this was also not very fruitful. So, and under the IBC regime, the adjudicating authorities are the NCLT and the NCLAT, which were formed after the repealing of BIFR and IFR. Now, how did the BIFR and IFR function? The BIFR was a board which was constituted by the rich and influential business holders who were a part of ministry. Now, these people, since it was a very new law, who else would have been into the position? Now, these people had extremely well-knitted contacts with the businessmen running their businesses. Now, when these businessmen used to approach these BIFR and IFR, the proceeding used to be stalled for years and years and years. I have my client who's proceeding, a proceeding against whom initiated back in 1994 under BIFR and could not till date reach NCLT. Lately in 2000, it reached the company law board, but no result was found to that. Now, today, 2.5 months back, a final solution has come to it by virtue of a settlement. And that is the power which the businessmen used to have when it was BIFR and IFR. It was nothing for them. It was a part play, a gameplay for them. And they could stall the legal process till whatever time they wanted because they had all their friends and kith and kin in the board. And so this process was not at all fruitful. So after amending BIFR and IFR, it was suggested that NCLT and NCLAT would come into picture. But it was never notified because there was being delay in establishment of these two bodies. So let's discuss the timeline. Of course, under SICA, it takes 1 to 2 years for further investigation of SIC companies only. Mind you, it is only talking about investigation and not talking about the solution or the repayment of debt. Okay. Now, under this law, it takes, I'm always forgetting which law is this. This is, I guess, RDDBFI, yes. Under RDD-BFI, it takes up approx 2 years. Under SARFAESI, it takes 1 to 2 years. And under RBI amendment, it is an ongoing process forever and ever. But under IBC, it talks about a model timeline which has been prescribed by corporate insolvency resolution process. Now, what is this model timeline? I would like to tell you here itself. So once a default is occurred, a demand notice has to be filed under section 7 or 9. Once you file demand notice, once you send the demand notice to the opposite party, a 15 days time is given to the opposite party to file a reply to this. Now, after this 15 days time, the creditor is free to approach the forum and file an application seeking insolvency of the debtor. Now, after approaching the forum, it is the NCLAT which has only 14 days to admit an application stating whether the corporate insolvency resolution process against this debtor will start or not. It has only 14 days of limited time. Further, after 14 days of limited time, if the CIRP is initiated and debt was proved as likely to be pending, it has the whole process of corporate insolvency resolution process, that from initiation till the liquidation or resolution of the company, has to be completed between 180 to 200 to 80 days. That is the only time limit for this whole process, which has become very effective and has been working fit and fine since 2016. So I guess I have explained all these terminologies which I have marked above. Okay, so yes, it says the process post which a company gets into liquidation, the period ranges from 180 to maximum of 270 days. Moving further, types of creditors covered. Here there were secured and unsecured. Under SICA, under RDD-BFI, they were again secured and unsecured. Under SARFAESI, there were only secured creditors. That means those who had some property against the loan given to them. Under the RBI amendment also, it was just the secured creditors. But under IBC, it takes care of operational as well as financial creditors, which include the secure and the unsecured creditors. Now, who are these operational and financial creditors, and what is the difference between them? I have laid down the definitions below, but I will try to explain it here itself so that it becomes easy for you. So when a company is running, it needs support in two ways. One with respect to finances and the other with respect to material. So when it comes to finances, the person giving money straight in the form of money, like real money, that person will be called a financial creditor. Whereas a person who is not giving real money, but is instead giving its services or goods for running the company, that kind of debt will be known as an operational debt. Okay, and that person who is giving such services or goods will be known as operational creditor, and the person who is giving such finances will be known as financial creditors. Person availing the financial credit will be known as financial debtor, and the person availing goods and services will be known as operational debtor. And both financial and operational creditors will be both secured and unsecured. Now, pillars of the legal regime. Here, under SICA, it was totally under the control of adjudicating authorities. Who were the adjudicating authorities? The BIFER and the IFER. And how did they function? They were absolutely corrupt. The process was completely stalled. Under the RDD-BFI, the specialized tribunal established under the Act used to function, but they were not very effective. Under the SARFAESI, the process dealt with mainly with public auction and enforcement of the security interest, which was carried through special purpose vehicles and the asset reconstruction company, which was effective but could not release the complete NPAs from the books of the banks and financial institutions. For the RBI amendments, it was the RBI regulations which took care of the everything. So this law was not very concrete and did not provide a unswerving solution to the problem at hand. But under the insolvency, the whole process is very formulated. There are multiple bodies which take care of different organs of this law and make sure that it is watertight and has no loopholes for creditors or debtors to take care of. So under the insolvency and bankruptcy, it is the IBBI board, the information utility, the NCLT and the NCLAT, and the insolvency professionals who take care of the whole regime of insolvency. So the key concepts of IBC. We start with the objectives first. The objective of this law, as I told you, was to detect early insolvency, and it is not mere a forum of recovery. You cannot approach NCLT and say that this much amount is due and I want to recover it. If you say this in the court, your petition or an application under Section 7 or 9 will be dismissed straight away. The terminology, though what you are trying to do is same, you're trying to recover the money, but the law is ambiguous. Ambiguous, not ambiguous per se, the law intends to deliver something else. It says that it is not any recovery forum. If you want to recover, if you simply want to recover the money, you can approach a civil court and file a recovery suit. Why did you approach NCLT? So here, in practicality, one has to speak in the court of law that the company is not in a healthy position to pay me or other financial or operational creditors, and therefore, in view of early insolvency, I request, or the council requests my lords, to please initiate the corporate insolvency resolution process. So this is the key of the law. If you by any chance happen to stand in the court and say that this much amount is pending and has to be recovered, for what? Your application is dismissed straight away on the very first or second hearing. So now we will move on to the objectives of the IBC as enshrined under the code itself. So IBC is an act to consolidate and amend the laws relating to the reorganization and insolvency resolution of. So who all fall under the ambit of IBC? A corporate person, a partnership firm, an individual. And how will the IBC function? It shall function in a time-bound manner. Okay. For what does the IBC function? It functions for maximization of value of assets of such persons, to promote entrepreneurship, availability of credit, and balance the interest of all the stakeholders, including alteration in order of the priority of payment of government dues. Now, the idea here is to maximize the assets of the company before its dilution and to distribute it to its stakeholders in an order of priority of payment, starting from the government dues. So there's a particular section and a particular model which describes the flow of payment after the company is dissolved, as to who will get the money first, whose stakes are the most, and who shall be on the top priority of the payment of dues. Section 52 of the code deals with the waterfall model. Now, this waterfall model describes the flow of payment starting from the first payment is to the IRP or the RP, thereafter the creditors, and thereafter the government dues. So there are 4-5 brackets. I don't remember it verbatim, but this is the major flow. So the two things to keep in mind for the waterfall fall model is the government dues come the end, unlike in other laws where the government dues are paid first. But under the IBC, the government dues are paid last, with the dues of the insolvency resolution professional who has carried out the whole proceedings is paid first, okay, and has the topmost priority. And the last objective of the IBC code is to establish an Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India and for matters connected therewith on or incidental thereto. So this IBBI board trains the valuers, the insolvency resolution professionals, who are the key pillars of the strength on whose shoulders this whole law runs. Okay, so these are the four objectives of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. Now I'm going to discuss certain definitions under the code which are very relevant for all of you to understand, to be able to practice this law in originality. So there are two definition clauses in this act, unlike all the other acts. One is section 3 and one is section 5. I have not listed down all the definitions here, but I have picked up certain terminologies which are important for you to understand. Section 3, clause 7 defines a corporate person. The corporate persons mean any person defined under section 2, subclause 20 of the Companies Act. Now let's see what the Companies Act says. So section 2, subclause 20 of the 2000 Company Act defines the term company to mean a company incorporated under the Companies Act 2013 or any previous company law. As simple as that. Okay. So corporate person means, number one, a company. Number two, a limited liability partnership as defined under this clause of the Limited Liability Partnership Act, or any other person incorporated with limited liability under any law for the time being in force, which shall not include any financial service provider. Okay, so this is the meaning of a corporate person. Section 3, clause 8 defines corporate debtor, means a person who owes a debt to any person. I just explained it above. 3, clause 10 defines a creditor, means any person to whom a debt is owed and includes a financial creditor, an operational creditor, a secured creditor, an unsecured creditor, and a decree holder. I have explained all these terms here. From here till here, I have already explained, but I will explain decree holder now. So, supposedly you are no one, as in you don't fall in any of these categories, but you approach a court of law and establish your right or your claim over a particular money or an amount, and you get a decree in your favor stating that you shall always fall into the category of creditor. Okay, so apart from these four categories, there is this fifth category called the decree holder. Moving forward, we read about debt under section 3, clause 11. Debt means a liability or obligation in respect of a claim which is due from any person and includes a financial debt and operational debt. Of course, the word itself says, the word debt itself talks about liability or an obligation. So in layman language also, we use the word debt or कर्ज in Hindi, which means udhar or something which one owes to somebody else. Okay, so debt I think is very clear. It is of two types, financial debt and operational debt. Now let's see what default is, because a default in terms of IBC is the trigger point for any application to be filed under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So default means non-payment of debt when whole or any part or installment of the amount of debt has become due and payable and is not paid by the debtor or the corporate debtor, as the case may be. Let's understand it in terms of example of a real estate company. Suppose I've bought a flat and I was supposed to get the possession of that flat in the year 2018. December 2018, let's presume. Now December 2018 has passed and I still did not get the possession of the flat. Neither have I been awarded with any registry in my name. Now when will the default occur? Suppose my sale purchase agreement of that flat stated that the possession of the flat shall be given to you in the second week of December 2018. So once the second week of December 2018 is over, that is the time when the trigger point hits and the default occurs. So from the second Sunday of the second week of December, the default arises, and now you are allowed and you can drag the debtor under the ambit of the IBC, because in this case you are a creditor, you have paid money, you're a financial creditor, you have paid money to avail the flat, and he was supposed to provide a service which he failed to do. I hope it's clear. Moving down, we understand the meaning of adjudicating authority. Section 5, clause 1 goes on to define adjudicating authority. and says that for the purpose of this part means NCLT constituted under section 408 of the Companies Act 2018. Here, the definition does not talk about NCLAT, but the NCLAT, in the practical sense, also forms a part of the adjudicating authority in cases of appeals. Okay. Now let's understand who is a corporate applicant. A corporate applicant can be any person from the company who has been running the company, who is a partner of the company, and who is authorized to make an application for the CIRP, that is the corporate insolvency resolution process of the company. Okay. Further, a corporate debtor can be an individual who is in charge of managing the operations and resources of the company, and a person who has control, supervision over the financial affairs of the company. So, a corporate debtor can be any key managerial person. Sorry, I was talking about the corporate applicant. Yes, so a corporate applicant can be any key managerial person or any director or any person who has authority or control over the key affairs and managerial affairs of the company. Financial creditor, I have explained earlier also, a person who owes any financial debt and includes a person to whom such debt has been legally assigned to or transferred to. Suppose I have given 10,000 rupees to any one of you, and Mr. B comes to me and says, okay, you take this 10,000 rupees from me and I will clear your debts with any one of you. So here I have taken the money from him, but I have transferred my debt to Mr. B. So here he is the legally assigned or transferee of my debt and shall be the new financial creditor for any one of you who has given me to whom I have given the loan. So let's moving forward. Section 5 clause 20 talks about operational creditor, means a person to whom an operational debt is owed, which is in the form of goods and services, and includes any person to whom such debt has been legally assigned or transferred to in the similar manner which I just explained about. So here, under 5 clause 21, operational debt means a claim in respect of the provision of goods or services, including employment, or a debt in respect of the payment of dues arising under any law, which also I've explained earlier. Now, let us understand the insolvency commencement date. Insolvency commencement date means the date of admission of an application for initiation of corporate insolvency resolution process. With this section, one needs to understand that the word admission here does not mean the date of filing of the petition. It means the date when your application was actually admitted by the court, saying that yes, your claims are valid, your dues are legit, and that the court has agreed to initiate corporate insolvency resolution process against the debtor. So that date from then will be computed as insolvency commencement date. And from here, 180 or 270 days shall be computed. And this date is very important with respect to section 7, 9 and 10 of the code. Moving further, section 5, subsection 25 talks about resolution applicant. Resolution applicant means a person who individually or jointly with any other person submits a resolution plan to the resolution professional pursuant to the invitation made. Now, when the corporate insolvency resolution process is initiated by the NCLT or the adjudicating authority, the first thing the court does is, number one, it assigns an insolvency resolution professional. Now, who is this insolvency resolution professional? This professional is a qualified professional who has passed an exam conducted by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Now, this insolvency resolution professional is appointed by either by the IBBI board or the creditor who is approaching the forum has the freedom to suggest any IRP of his choice. Now, when it comes to suggestion, under section 7, it is compulsory for the financial creditor to recommend the name of the IRP. Whereas under section 9, it is not compulsory for a creditor, to recommend the name, and it can leave such suggestion upon the wisdom of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. So, as soon as the CIRP process is initiated, the IRP is appointed, a notification is sent to the IRP by the court itself, and also by the party who has approached the forum seeking CIRP process against the debtors. The first thing the IRP does is to call a meeting of both the parties and fix his fees for the whole process. This is the first thing he does. The second thing he does is to form a committee of creditors, as in it will invite claims from everybody. It will make a publication in all the leading newspapers of the state in the regional language, in English and in Hindi, and declare that this particular company is now under the corporate insolvency resolution process, and any financial or operational creditor, whoever has its claims against the company, may submit their claim to the IRP. Now the IRP will cumulate all the claims, form a committee of creditors out of them, and proceed with the further steps. So this is the job of the insolvency resolution process professional. Now, at which stage does the IRP turns into an RP, that is the resolution professional? After the committee of creditors is formed and the situation is and the procedure is moved ahead, an election is done between the COC to decide whether the IRP shall continue as the RP or not. So if the COC votes in favor, the same IRP becomes the RP, that is the resolution professional, and carries out the corporate insolvency resolution process till the end. Otherwise, if there are no votes in his favor or the votes are less, a new professional is appointed at the post of resolution professional, not in the position of IRP. Okay. Now, moving with this, a resolution plan is proposed. Now, this resolution plan can be proposed. Somebody's mic is switched on. Please switch it off. It is really causing disturbance. Thank you. So yes, a resolution plan is proposed. Now, what is the purpose of the resolution plan? As I stated earlier, the idea is to bring back the company to its legs. So how will that happen? Who will provide it?
Modi aa gaya?
So who will provide it a plan? A corporate professional will provide it a plan. Who is this professional? The person who has been a part of the company. The resolution plan shall be provided by them and shall make sure that the company will revive on its own. So this plan can include merger, an acquisition, or a restructuring. It can move on to anything and everything, just for the sake of revival of the company. Moving forward, it talks about a resolution professional, which I have just spoken about. So these are the relevant sections under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, where the initiation of the CIRP process takes place. Under Section 7, a financial creditor is bound to file a petition. Under Section 8, the insolvency resolution by an operational creditor can take place. And under Section 10, the CIRP process by the company itself, that means the corporate applicant, can take place. So I have given a brief, or you can say a vast gist, so that all of you can understand what I'm trying to say. I have mentioned a case law here, which will again go into a lot of detail, but this is not the need as of now. And with this, I am concluding my session for today. And I hope most of your doubts are cleared. And the session is now open for any questions if you have.
Good
Riya,
afternoon, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, so the first question by participant is,
Suppose a company pledges his share as a security to his creditor and he fails to register his charge. Then what will be the status as a creditor?
A company pledges his shares and he fails to register the charges. What will be the status
Yes.
of the
What will be his status as a creditor?
status of the company?
The
Can you
status
type the question? Riya, can you type the question?
Sure, ma'am. 1 minute.
Ma'am, it's already typed, I think, all the
It is
questions.
on somewhere on the top. Rishabh Singh, is that you?
No issues, ma'am. I'll forward. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, a consent form has to be signed by the IRP stating that he has no direct relations or links with the current dispute at hand and that he's free of any such charges. Okay, so yes,
Ma'am, is there any name of that consent form?
yes,
Or
there,
is
the
it
name of the
generally can write
consent,
it?
the name of the consent form is present in the act, and I do not remember the act verbatim. You can please go to the schedule and figure that out. Thank you. Riya has put up a relevancy of civil court in case of insolvency. So yes, see, the earlier the practice was that under civil court, if there is any recovery which is pending before IBC, we used to approach the civil courts for the and file a recovery suit for our matters, and we kept on proving that through trials, through cross examinations, that what is the debt and how much is the debt. So that was the process under the civil procedure code. But under the insolvency, it is a tribunal which is a fast track court and it works in a time bound manner and happens to be more effective and extremely viable in the present scenario where the economy of the country is on the verge of sinking and there are a lot of changes required. There, Arnab Chakrabarti has answered. The name of the consent form is Form 2. Thank you, Arnab.
Ma'am, it's Form AA. Form 2 is the form which is given at the time of giving your consent as IRP. Form AA is given when IRP is changed to RP or RP is changed.
Sir, how do you practice, sir?
Sorry?
Rishabh, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
I think you are my senior. And who is this? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello? Let's see. Yes, sir. Please enlighten the students. You were saying something. You were talking about some form. Yes,
It's Form AA, ma'am.
it's Form AA. Thank you so much.
Yeah. That's okay. Yeah.
Yes. Anything else? Yes. Suppose a company pledges his share as a security and he fails to register his charge. What will be his status as creditor? Now, this is a very technical question and this will definitely need a research. I will get back to this question, Riya. And whoever has asked this, please can give them my details. I will definitely answer this. It's a very interesting question.
Sure, ma'am. And so the next question is, what is the relevance? What will be the relevancy of civil court?
I
in
answered
case
this
of-
question. I answered this question.
Oh,
I answered.
fine. Okay, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, considering the COVID-19 situation, shall the newly introduced Section 66, Clause 3 will apply and be interpreted in specific transactions, or will it be used as a general exemption from Section 66, Clause 2 for the total exemption period of time due to pandemic?
Okay. So this particular amendment or this particular change under the insolvency regime subject to the pandemic has been brought down to reduce the burden on the companies. And this this relief has been brought only for a limited time period, okay, and not for the absolute time, and shall not be construed for time immemorial, or it will not go on forever and ever. So yes, as the question answers itself, it says that shall the newly introduced section 663 will apply and be interpreted in specific transactions, or will it be used as a general exemptions? No. Firstly, it is not retrospective, and the amendment talks and states that the amendment came into light on 24th March and went on to be applicable from 25th March. So any fresh insolvency cases arising from 25th March will not be entertained below the bracket of 1 crore rupees. Rest will be entertained, which were existing prior to 25th March. So there are no specific transactions related to it, but yes, there is a timeline to it. And the threshold of 1 crore as of now is temporary, may stick or may not stick in future.
Okay, ma'am. I hope the participant got the answer. Ma'am, so the next question is, was the suspension of IBC actually necessary? Is suspension of Section 10 justified?
This is a very good question. The suspension of Section 10 is justified or not? See, there is a reason to it. What the court, let's talk about the actual practices. Section 10 talks about voluntary liquidation. So what these people do is they approach the forum, declare themselves as bankrupt. When they declare themselves as bankrupt, the liabilities decreases by leaps and bounds. So, and with certain kind of arrangement with the resolution professionals, they dilute their liabilities, and from the back end, they buy that company again. So this has been a practice from time immemorial since the inception, and yes, this points out a loophole again. So for the time of this pandemic, or in the recent time, this suspension has taken place, but it is not very justified. In fact, before this pandemic also, all Section 10 applications were not being taken up by the court. The court has always been a little skeptical when it came down to these Section 10 applications, because the intent of the creditors or the people approaching the court under Section 10 has not been very clear. They do not approach the forum with the clean hand. So yes, and talking about the amendment, it says that it relieves the companies from debt during the period of pandemic, but at the time in future when this particular amendment will be dissolved and all the creditors will rush to the forum to release their amount back, to get their amount back, imagine the level of threshold, the level of funds which shall be bounding and pounding on the debtors, which will leave the debtors with no other option but to dissolve themselves. As of now, if the debts accrue to them slowly, there might be chances that they can recover by payment or by way of settlement out of court. But after the suspension period of an year and a half, or maybe 2, depends upon the COVID-19 situation, when the forums will open again and will make themselves available for this pandemic situation, the scenario will be definitely painful, and we will see a lot of insolvency cases rising time and again. Could you please, yes, Goria.
Could you explain the relevancy of IBC in case of merger and acquisition?
So as I told you earlier, when a corporate debtor needs a restructuring, as in to bring it back to its position or to make it functional, can that corporate debtor, how will it survive? There are certain ways for its survival. So if it cannot survive on its own, a resolution plan can come wherein a merger is proposed of that company with another company, or an acquisition is proposed of that company with another company, so that the overall assets of the companies increases and the liabilities are decreased. So in that way, the IBC and the impact of merger and acquisition plays it is a kind of a team role for reviving and restructuring the companies.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is, how does the time lapse and prolonged CIRP process serve the purpose of Code 2016 timely resolution?
I
We
mean,
also
the CIRP can be extended for certain factors like incomplete CIRP. Definitely, Songkrito, you're very well aware. It does extend for it, but then there is also a limit to the extension of CIRP. You cannot, the maximum time you can extend the CIRP is 2 to 3, not beyond that. And in practice, the code does not allow it beyond 2 times. And these 2 times are extension of maximum of 90 periods and not beyond that. So yes, this time, the whole idea is to conclude the proceedings in a timely manner and
Ma'am,
not
what
extend
about
it forever.
330 days time period? Sorry to
That
interrupt,
is what
ma'am,
I'm.
but
Yes,
yeah.
and there are exceptions, but due to COVID period, as you can see now, this whole thing has gone for a toss. So let's see how it takes place. So laws are something which keep on evolving and we cannot say much about it. So yes, the initial idea of the law was to curtail it within the 330 days or the 280 or the 180 days, 120 days which were prescribed, subject to extension, but not beyond that. But now since this law is very new and it's still evolving, let's see how the market practices take place.
okay, ma'am. So one of the participants is asking if there are any case laws for section 7 and 8.
Of course, there are hundreds of case laws. Please Google. This is a very, very lame question, I would say. I'm sorry to say that. But yes, please Google this question. There are so many questions. There's SR Steel, there's Innoventive, there is Mobilox, which I've mentioned here. They are dealing with intrinsic issues like time value for money, like the trigger point of default, what is default, and what is a pre-existing dispute, when does a pre-existing dispute happen, at what time should one project a pre-existing dispute, what happens if you have not already raised a pre-existing dispute. These are a matter of intense deliberation and you will understand only if you read through the cases. If I mention the names here, they will not solve your purpose.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, so the next question is by Sangrito again. Don't you think the clustering of the home buyers as an eligibility criteria and the capacity of financial creditors put a hindrance to many genuine agreed home buyers? Like a separate home buyer needs to wait to kick in that threshold to approach the honorable court.
Of course it does. I mean, I am a victim of this law per se. So yes, the law says that it has to be either 1/10 of the people of a project or 100 people, 100 allottees of that project. So it is difficult for an individual to form a part of the 1/10 of the category or 100 or to call upon 100 people who are ready to approach the court of law. So the Supreme Court is yet to decide on it, Shankrito. We have to wait and see what the final decision is. Till then, all the proceedings are at hold. Let's see what the Supreme Court has to say. Till the time Supreme Court doesn't give its verdict, I will also wait and we will discuss this.
Ma'am, so the next question is, what is the current scenario pertaining to cross-border insolvency in India and its close connection with group insolvency? The code is definitely not a first head, but what is actually being done to drive the transformation and how pertinent is this issue?
Of course, cross-border insolvency is an extremely pertinent issue. In fact, after the globalization and the inclination of a government being capitalist in nature and wanting investments from all across the world, opening FDIs to even almost to the agriculture sector, if not exactly. The cross-border insolvency is something which is yet to be involved. We are working on it. There's a concept of twilight insolvency, if you guys have heard about it. So this concept is also extremely interesting and it is a part and parcel of the cross-border insolvency in India. So what is actually being done about cross-border insolvency is the court does not addresses it for sure. And when it comes to this fact, I have to read about it a little more. I am not very sure, but I will get back to this question, Mudit Jain. I am actually about to launch a research on this and come up with relevant facts with the cross-border insolvency in its connection to the Indian regime. So maybe a next session or a next YouTube video with this question.
Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, the next question is, why can't Section 138 NI criminal complaints be covered under Section 14 of moratorium, considering all others like
Where
suits,
is this question?
execution
Okay.
petition, etc. are stayed?
Okay, here. Why can't 138 NI criminal complaints be covered under Section 14 of moratorium, considering all others like suit, execution, petitions, etc. are stayed? So this has been a latest development and amendment, whereas 138 NI has been exempted. It was a check bounce issue. I am recalling. You guys are driving beyond the topic which was prescribed for the webinar, but these are issues which I have to deal with. I have read about it, but I'm sorry I will not be able to answer this as of now. And you can please shoot in the remaining queries. The queries have gone on, and Mudit and Nikhil have been answered, and Rishabh and Sonkrito have raised some really pertinent questions, but which were beyond the scope of the webinar which I was planning to discuss today, which was morely student-centric and was to be dealing with the basics of the insolvency law, apart from these questions which are extremely technical and practical in nature, which the students of the second, third, and fourth year might not even relate to. So yes, all of you who are being practicing here and have come up with really relevant questions, I would like to Josh Rasta shoots them to me, and I will mail each of you individually and will be answering all of it. And the session has exceeded the time. So, Ria, I will see how many more questions can I answer. As far as 138 is, I cannot answer you exactly, but I will look into it and get back to you.
Sure, ma'am. Ma'am, can we extend the webinar till 4:30? I guess there are questions right now.
Keep shooting, I will pick up the questions. I will. Should NCLAT be given the discretion to analyze a resolution plan on the basis if AVM principle in light of Maharashtra Senior Steel judgment earlier this year? See, when it comes to the resolution plan, see, NCLAT as a forum is not a place which decides the technicality of an issue or how this particular company who is under the corporate insolvency resolution process supposed to function. Okay, so at no point of time can the appellate authority or the adjudicating authority be given the power by any means to decide whether the resolution plan is well or not for the companies under the CIRP process. It is and for this purpose, the committee of creditors is formed to decide the welfare and the well-being of the company. So the way it is going on is, as of now, remains okay. And let's see what the court has to decide. But on my personal level, I do not feel and I do not opinionate that any adjudicating authority or the appellate authority should have any discretion to analyze any resolution plans when it comes to the technicalities or basic issues of it. Okay, so this question is, how helpful is the recent amendment to Section 4 as far as creditors are concerned, and also as far as the debtors are? Oh, this question is important. As I said here, the recent amendment of Section 4 increases the threshold to 1 crore rupees, because of which very few fresh applications are being entertained in the court. Almost none of them are being entertained, and which will create a cascading impact on the debtors, because they will be piled up with the fresh debts when the forums will open. And coming down to financial creditors, they will be on the loss of money. They will not be able to recover their money. The liquidity will decrease by leaps and bounds, which will cause problem to them in the functionings. Because when they gave the money to the debtors, the idea was not to stall or to leave the money for time immemorial, for like whatever time they want to. So yes, it will definitely cast a cascading impacts both on the creditors in the current times and on the debtors in the future times when actually the forum opens. This was not a very wise decision, in my opinion. The court, instead of increasing the threshold to 1 crore, could have come up with something else, maybe a lesser threshold, because from 1 lakh to 1 crore, the increase is around more than 1000%, and which could not be justified. Initially, the idea was to just protect the MSMEs, but when the MSMEs part was waived off, the whole thing went for a toss. So yes, the creditors and debtors are both at loss when it comes to the amendment. Okay. Rahul Bhardwaj, your cross-border insolvency is something which I'm yet to work on. I'm a practicing professional who works on the current latest affairs in the NCLT and NCLAT with domestic cases so far. So the moment I get any exposure of the cross-border insolvencies, I will definitely put it across to all of you. Till then, since this question has prompted up so much, and that people are conscious and want to know more about it, I will take the initiative to learn and develop my knowledge and get back to all of you with this. Any more questions? Any feedback? Thank you. Ria, I don't find any more questions. Are there?
Ma'am, even I'm seeing. If there are any, I'll let you know.
Please provide them with the feedback link. A lot of them have been asking for feedback link. And I would also like to get a feedback from all of you.
So, ma'am, we'll provide everyone with the feedback link. And ma'am, that's all the questions for today. If there will be any, I guess we'll ask them to mail us.
Yes, please. And to all of you who have attended the webinar, I will answer all of you, should replies to all of you to the questions which I have left unanswered within next 24 hours. And this is my promise. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar.
Thank you so
Over
much,
to you,
ma'am.
Ria.